You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 274 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Joining me on today's show is Will Porter. Will is a freelance journalist. His work has been published at antiwar.com, Consortium News, and frequently at the Libertarian Institute, which is, of course, where you can find this show, Foreign Policy Focus, and my daily news roundup. Will, welcome back to the show.
How you doing?
I'm doing well, Will, and glad to have you back on the show. This was a very impromptu call that we put together here, but basically what we have is a statement by Donald Trump finally on the Khashoggi murder. Of course, he was murdered on October 2nd, so we're about a month and a half or a little bit more now even into this whole saga that, has had some information drip out very slowly, but overall, in a lot of ways, is still a mystery as to exactly what happened. So me and Will are going to be discussing that today. So I'm going to go ahead and read the first few paragraphs here, and then me and Will are going to kind of discuss in Trump's statement. All right, so here we go. The world is a very dangerous place. The country of Iran, as an example, is responsible for a bloody proxy war against Saudi Arabia and Yemen, trying to destabilize Iraq's fragile attempt at democracy, supporting the terror group Hezbollah in Yemen, Lebanon, propping up dictator Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who has killed millions of his own citizens, and much more. Likewise, the Iranians have killed many Americans and other innocent people throughout the Middle East. Iran states openly, with great force, death to America, death to Israel. Iran is considered the world leading sponsor of terror, and that's, of course, in quotes. I believe he's actually quoting himself there. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia would gladly withdraw from Yemen if the Iranians would agree to leave. They would immediately provide desperately needed humanitarian assistance. Additionally, Saudi Arabia has agreed to spend billions of dollars in leading the fight against radical Islamic terrorism. All right, Will, so this, I have to say, is interesting that this is the opening of a statement about the Khashoggi murder, seeing how Khashoggi has not been mentioned yet. But I'll go ahead and let you start off by giving
Yeah, you're definitely right. It's kind of like a far digression to make to get to Khashoggi from this. The first thing you'll notice, though, is that between the heading of the statement and the first sentence of it, there are 2 exclamation points. So I just, like, the way this is written, it's just, like, laden with exclamation points and weird phrasings, which maybe Trump himself did actually write this thing. I don't know. But one of the first things that pops out to me, at least just factually, is the claim that Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, has killed millions of his own citizens. Like millions, like plural, more than 1 million. When not even like a little over, I think, 500,000 have died in the Syrian civil war, and it's about evenly split between the sides. So it's just absurd. Like, I don't know if anyone fact checked this. He blatantly says millions of his own citizens, and like there's just no facts can support that whatsoever.
Right. I don't know. I don't want to downplay the catastrophe that is the Syrian civil war. And I think on this show in the past, you'll see the history here is, talking very much about how terrible that war is and how much we need it to end. However, the idea that millions of civilians had died is simply untrue. The number may be in the hundreds of thousands, but I think the high end estimates put, about 500,000 people dying in that war, but that includes the, probably 100,000 or so rebel fighters at least that have been killed. I mean, at one time the estimates were like 100,000 ISIS fighters, and who knows how many moderate rebels and other jihadist types who have been killed. The Kurds that have been killed by those rebel factions. It includes the people that were killed by the United States, whether the Islamic State or civilians in eastern Syria. And we know from air wars that number is in the thousands. Turkey has killed probably tens of thousands of Kurds, especially in the invasion of Afrin. Russia is responsible for a lot of bombing. And a lot of the other casualties are of the Syrian army themselves. And so 500,000 Syrians possibly have died in this war. And, even if that number is as low as 350,000, it's still an absolute tragedy that will, take years and years to really start to make this up in Syria, and will have a lasting terrible impact on the country. However, the number of civilians that have died is probably, somewhere over 100,000, but not as high as 200,000.
Yeah, exactly. And I definitely don't mean to downplay to say only 500,000 people have died in this whole conflict, but you can't just say millions of his own citizens. That's just not true factually. And yes, some of the numbers I've seen for the Syrian Arab Army and their allied militias puts it at over 100,000 casualties. So both, many sides are incurring a lot of losses in this war. It's not just a one-sided thing, tragic as it is. Now, the next thing in the statement that I think is interesting to point out is the idea that the Iranians need to agree to leave Yemen. But no one can even really cite anything specific about them being there physically at all. The claims are that they somehow back the Houthis, but even those are not very well borne out. And so the idea that, we just skip over all the backing of this and just say they need to agree to leave when it's not even established that they're there.
Right, and it's very hard to see how, the way it's framed as Iran fighting a bloody proxy war against Saudi Arabia, I don't know how that actually makes sense. I know that the narrative is that this is a Saudi Iranian proxy war, but even then, the Saudis are clearly the aggressors here. They, started the bombing campaign. Even Obama admitted that, the Iranians weren't backing the Houthis, especially, prior to 2015. When you look at it, the Iranians were telling the Houthis, not to take the capital city of Sana'a, and then to, chase the Yemeni government south. They explicitly were saying, don't do this to the Houthis who did it anyways. And so, the missiles didn't start being fired into Saudi Arabia until the, bombs started to come from Saudi Arabia. So I'm not quite sure how it's framed as an Iran-led proxy war against the Houthis, even in, kind of the distorted, neoconservative narrative. And then also, like you're saying, the Iranians should say, sure, we'll leave Yemen. We're not even there. I don't understand. They're setting a mark for Yemen that can't possibly be met, or it's already true.
So you would expect them, at this stage, if they were saying this in the statement, you would expect that Iran would have already admitted to sort of being there or something, and then now we get them to agree to leave or something. Yeah, the notion that Iran is backing the Houthis, there are two specific examples we could cite that I think are the strongest ones they have, and they're flimsy. You have the case of the Jihan, which is a ship that was alleged to be carrying weapons from Iran to the Houthis in Yemen, but likely it was en route for Somalia. It was not even intended for Yemen, so it couldn't have been for the Houthis. Not to mention the fact that Yemen is awash in small arms. It's one of the most heavily armed countries on the planet. And then the other case would be the missiles that they claim that they found that they say are Iranian, which are way more likely Soviet missiles that were given to Iraq and eventually made their way into Yemen, but they did not at any point come from Iran.
Right. I also wanted to mention, Trump highlights this statement that, the Iranian chant, death to America, death to Israel. And of course, a lot of times when I talk to people about the Houthis in Yemen and explain that they're not the enemies of the Americans, they say, well, their slogan is death to Israel, death to America. This is, first of all, a political slogan. And as nasty of a political slogan as it is, Ted Cruz joked about turning the Middle East into glass. So, our politicians make those kind of disgusting Holocaust jokes as well. And, the U.S. foreign policy is much more likely to drop a nuclear bomb on, Syria or Iraq than it is that, the Houthis come and invade the United States of America. And also, this being a representation of the fact that it's the U.S. and, in part the Israel, kind of led drive to isolate Iran. That's going to, start to prevent Iranians from getting medicine. It's going to make their civilian air fleet less, safe and more Iranians are going to die. There may start to be shortages of different products in Iran, and this is all because of the U.S. sanctions. Likewise, in Yemen, the people see that the bombs coming from the sky are being dropped by American planes, and they're American-made bombs. And so, there's a reason that the chants are what they are. it's not necessarily an actual, like, legitimate threat that could actually happen.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty commonplace, especially in this region of the world, and really all over the world, but especially in, like, the Middle East, the Arab world, the Muslim world. There's oftentimes a lot of very, like, fiery rhetoric and bluster that come out from governments and their foreign ministries and stuff. I mean, even Israel, if you look at their statements, they're often very harsh. I mean, even the things that are being said in this very Trump statement, like, are pretty, like, blustery and harsh. So I don't know. The slogan, death to America, death to Israel. Yeah, I'm not a personal fan of that, but I don't think it's all that different if you compare it to the conduct of other countries around the world.
Well, and Mike Pompeo just recently said that the Iranian leaders must comply with the Americans if they want their people to eat.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty explicit threat to starve the Iranian people. And again, the big difference is that the Americans could actually do this and did this in the neighboring country. And so, there's plenty of reason to believe that, yeah, the U.S. would apply sanctions on Iran so tough if they could that they would starve hundreds of thousands of Iranians to death. And, that would just be the policy.
And so, yeah, we don't say death to Iran, but, like, that is sort of the outcome anyway.
The last thing I want to mention here, Will, is just that, Trump brings up the war in Yemen. He says that the Saudis would be, gladly willing to withdraw from Yemen, and then points out that Saudi Arabia has agreed to spend billions of dollars fighting against radical Islamic terrorism. I guess I would like to point out first the fact that there's a great interview a Mansrader did with Brian McGlinchey, 28 pages on the Saudi lobby influence in America. And in there, they discuss some Saudi ties to radical Islamic terrorism. And so you should definitely check that out to get like more of a background. But, just looking at kind of the small battlefield in Yemen, we have a Reuters article, like just kind of saying in passing that it's getting very hard for the U.S. to wage their drone war in Yemen against Al-Qaeda because Al-Qaeda has now joined the U.S.-backed forces. Mostly that's the Emirates, but also that's the Saudi side of the war, fighting against the Houthis and the alleged Iranian-backed forces. And so if anybody is fighting terrorism in Yemen, by the narrative that Trump lays out, it's the Iranians, not the Americans.
Right, even on the face of their own claims, which they can't prove, but even taking that on face value, like still, you don't get the conclusion they're trying to get you to accept.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next sentence here. After my heavily negotiated trip to Saudi Arabia last year, the kingdom agreed to spend and invest $450 billion in the United States. This is a record amount of money. It will create hundreds of thousands of jobs, tremendous economic development, and much additional wealth for the United States. Of the $450 billion, $110 billion will be spent on purchases of military equipment from Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and many other great U.S. defense contractors. If we foolishly cancel these contracts, Russia and China would be the enormous beneficiaries and very happy to acquire all the newfound business. It would be a wonderful gift to them directly from the United States. And that last sentence has an exclamation point again.
Yeah, wow.
All right, well, I'll let you have
I was going to say, wow, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon. That's like, represents all American interests. If they're getting lots of money, then that must mean we're all benefiting. Which clearly that's not the case. Like if there's actually great reporting by Kelly B. Vlahos, I believe at the American Conservative, about the sort of arms industry and like lobbying industries in Washington D.C. And like there are super rich areas around the centers of power. And these are the people who are getting rich. These are the people who are benefiting from these kind of crony arms deals, not the average dude, not the blue collar working the coal miner in Michigan or something. So I just think this is the most preposterous way to sell this, that like this gangster arms deals, like world-class global gangsterism is being sold as some kind of great like economic boon to us. I don't know. Forgive me if I'm a little skeptical of that.
Right. And, I think there's also at the end here this idea that Russia and China would be the enormous beneficiaries. I don't know if that's the case. I mean, the Saudis seem like a huge liability to U.S. foreign policy. I mean, look at, this statement. What's going on right now is that the Saudis ruthlessly murdered Jamal Khashoggi. And, now the Trump is putting out this ridiculous statement about it. And he's going to have Republicans in the Senate, warhawks like Lindsey Graham, fighting against his foreign policy. And so it seems like this should really be a negative for Donald Trump.
Absolutely. And I think, this whole situation with Khashoggi definitely should have been a negative on Saudi too, but we'll get to that.
Right. I just meant in the U.S. politically, Trump's ties to Saudi Arabia are a negative for him. I just want to clarify. I realized that wasn't very clear. And it's just crazy to me that he would, see this as like, not pawning, at best, this ends up just being, the Russians now had to manage Mohammed bin Salman, who's obviously a reckless idiot.
If the Russians and the Chinese or whatever, if they want to buy or if they want to sell a bunch of weapons to Saudi and have some crazy military empire, dude, go at it. Let them see what that reached them. I'm not so sure they are exactly interested in that kind of thing, though. Like, I think they're interested in maneuvering geopolitically, but I don't know if they want the same kind of, domination the U.S. is going for.
Right. And again, I think you just made the most important point here is just that this isn't really an economic boon to the United States. Right. Not the people, at least. Maybe to the elites. Moving on here. And this is finally in Trump's statement about Jamal Khashoggi. We get statements about Jamal Khashoggi. The crime against Jamal Khashoggi was a terrible one, and one that our country does not condone. Indeed, we have taken strong action against those already known to have participated in the murder. After a great independent research, we now know the details of this horrible crime. After this great independent research, we now know many details of this horrible crime. We have already sanctioned 17 Saudis known to have been involved in the murder of Mr. Khashoggi and the disposal of his body. Representatives of Saudi Arabia say that Jamal Khashoggi was an enemy of the state and a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. But my decision is in no way based on that. This is an unacceptable and horrible crime. King Salman and the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman vigorously deny any knowledge of the planning or execution of the murder of Mr. Khashoggi. Our intelligence agencies continue to assess all information, but it could very well be that the Crown Prince had knowledge of this tragic event. Maybe he did, and maybe he didn't. That being said, we may never know all the facts surrounding the murder of Mr. Jamal Khashoggi. In any case, our relationship is with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They have been a great ally in our important fight against Iran. The United States intends to remain a steadfast partner of Saudi Arabia to ensure the interests of our country, Israel, and all other partners in the region. It is our paramount goal to eliminate the threat of terrorism throughout the world. All right, well, maybe we should start off here by just saying, what the actual evidence is here that Mohammed bin Salman actually ordered this murder.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of this evidence is coming from the Turkish government and Turkish intelligence. So they were some of the first to come out and say that, Saudi's definitely responsible for killing Jamal Khashoggi. And Khashoggi, I should say, he's like a Saudi expat, or was a Saudi expat, lived in the United States and was a Washington Post columnist. Now, the Turks said that on October 2nd, Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate in Turkey. I think it was just some mundane business, had to do with marriage papers. He was getting married. His fiance was with him. But Khashoggi entered that consulate building and never left. And so the Turkish investigators believe that he was dismembered within that building and killed, and his remains and his belongings that were on him were sort of whisked away from the premises. And so I don't believe that any of his remains have been found. Maybe you can correct me on that, but maybe some of his belongings have. But yeah, so the Turks claim it was a 15-man team that were involved in assassinating this journalist. The Saudis initially completely denied it. They just issued a blanket denial. Nope, he left. He's fine. But eventually they were kind of forced to admit that no, actually, this guy probably did die in the consulate building, but it was a result of a brawl, a fist fight. It resulted from an argument that he died. They gave him a lethal injection or something. And I believe that is sort of the narrative they're keeping, is that indeed there was some kind of fight that broke out and they had to subdue him with some kind of injection, and that's what ended up killing him. And so I'm not sure how much of that is totally confirmed. The fact that Khashoggi is dead definitely is. The number of suspects and stuff, the Turks say 15. I believe 21 people have been held in Saudi Arabia, 11 of them indicted and 5 of them facing death penalty charges.
Right. Well, I think another interesting piece to this is Trump's kind of idea that we can't really know what, he really tries to make it sound like we can't know what happened. which, to some extent is probably true. We won't know exactly if, Mr. Khashoggi maybe was given a chance to fight back or not. Maybe he realized they were going to kill him and took a couple swings before they, tried to subdue him, or if they, tortured him and dismembered him. I think there's even one report saying that happened while he was still alive. And so that we can't know, but there is a clear picture here that he was murdered within the embassy. And, you really have Trump trying to avoid any ties to Mohammed bin Salman. However, his top advisor has been caught up in this. His younger brother is alleged to have actually been the one that told Khashoggi to go to the consulate in Istanbul. At that time, he was the U.S. ambassador, or the Saudi ambassador to the United States. And so, and Trump himself has refused to watch the actual killing of Mr. Khashoggi. And so it seems to me that he's trying to exercise some cognitive dissonance on himself and not expose himself to all the facts and leave it kind of open to the possibility that, this was just kind of a mistake. That way he doesn't have to realize the reality that his Saudi allies murdered this guy brutally.
Right. And maybe a couple other things that should be noted too here is that the Saudi Attorney General has come out and acknowledged that indeed this guy was killed by rogue operatives within Saudi Arabia. So it's definitely officially accepted that, Khashoggi was killed in this consulate building, even by Saudi. And yes, several of the suspects, the people accused of being involved in this assassination, do have some kind of direct ties to bin Salman. I believe you even said one of his top advisors or higher advisors. Definitely a intelligence official named Major General Ahmed al-Asiri is being sort of he's kind of the fall guy in this. And interestingly, actually, the New York Times ran a piece a couple weeks ago that speculated that Asiri would be blamed for this and sort of he would take the fall. And I had actually since in my notes written that okay, that never came to anything. The New York Times was wrong about that. But actually, no, here we go. I think he's been indicted now, this Asiri guy, and he's being sort of held as one of the highest up officials in the plot.
I also want to bring up the fact that, Trump tries to make a big deal out of sanctioning 17 people. Just a note here, and maybe as a comparison, if we agree that the Saudis murdered this guy, to draw a parallel to the alleged attempted poison or murder of Sergei Skripal in the UK, we, sanctioned Russia, several people, definitely more than 17. We had expelled 50 Russian ambassadors from the United States of America. So, to look at the difference there, it doesn't seem like this action is really that serious at all.
In the Skripal case, it was just immediately assumed this is a high level, top, centrally planned operation from the Russians. Whereas with the Saudis, they're so ridiculously willing to accept the idea that it's rogue elements. Why would rogue elements randomly? I mean, I don't know. Khashoggi very well could have had some shady ties and sordid dealings with people. But I don't know, it just seems odd that a rogue team would want to take this guy out when Khashoggi has been a critic of MbS personally and sort of his purges. I know Khashoggi had friends who actually got swept up in some of the purges. A guy named Bin Talal, a businessman, I think was one of the people locked up in the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. And so, yeah, it gets very odd. The details get very odd here. But the last thing I'd like to note is that Trump seems to sort of leave it open. He seems to kind of give a wink and a nudge. In the statement, he says maybe he did it, maybe he didn't. And in previous interviews, Trump has said things about Mohammed bin Salman, about he's running things. And so if anybody were going to be knowledgeable about this, it would be him. And so Trump has sort of made it pretty clear what he believes about this. So it's odd that he's going with this. Or I guess not odd if he believes that the economic boon is so great. I guess that would be the reason he would go along with it.
All right. The last thing I want to ask you about here is this. I think very important sense, and probably one the media will focus on the most, because I think from a humanitarian situation, it may be kind of the most disgusting, which is representatives of Saudi Arabia say that Jamal Khashoggi was an enemy of the state and a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in this way, it really seems like Trump is trying to get down a man who was brutally assassinated.
Yeah, that's definitely an obvious smear. Why would you... if your whole point about this is what a terrible tragedy it is, why would you, mitigate it with that? Oh, by the way, he's an alleged enemy of the state and, Muslim, might as well have called him a terrorist or something. I just think that's an odd way to explain how tragic his death was. But I mean, it is true. I should say that like Khashoggi, I believe, did have some like known ties to the Muslim Brotherhood in his younger years. Like it's not clear that he really was a member or maintained that kind of relationship, though.
Or, you know, and to clarify, the Muslim Brotherhood isn't Al-Qaeda.
Right, true.
All right, now I will go ahead and, this is the last little paragraph we have here. I understand there are members of Congress who, for political or other reasons, would like to go in a different direction, and they are free to do so. I will consider whatever ideas are presented to me, but only if they are consistent with the absolute security and safety of America. After the United States, Saudi Arabia is the largest oil producing nation in the world. They have worked closely with us and have been very responsive to my request to keeping oil prices at reasonable levels, so important for the world. As President of the United States, I intend to assure in a very dangerous world, America is pursuing its national interests and vigorously contesting countries that wish to do us harm. Very simply is called America.
Exclamation point. Hello? I see.
Now, to get into asking you a question about this, well, I guess, Will, this is like kind of just a very interesting paragraph that he's kind of like, if anybody wants to present another idea, they could let me know. But, it seems like he's saying that I'm just going to go in the direction that I am, and that members of Congress would only object to this for political reasons. Now, he does say political or other reasons, but the fact that he even adds in political really says that that's, what he's claiming.
He's like, I'll definitely take any like consideration, or I'll consider anything you have to say, but it's obviously all politically motivated and, not genuine. I'm the one, I'm the one pursuing an America first policy here, and you guys are just like making drama for your career. It's sort of how he's implying here.
Well, in reality, and I think maybe we could, kind of wrap up our discussion of this with this, idea that I don't think it's an America first policy. This statement to me says it's a Saudi first policy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what it seems to be. I mean, we pursue just about at every step along the way, we do the thing that, like, if you would not expect it to be any different. You wouldn't expect any different outcome if, like, there were Saudi agents running our foreign policy or something. Like, it wouldn't be any different in the outcomes. And so, yeah, absolutely not an America first policy. And it's not only just Saudi first. There's all kinds of other, like, things that we pursue around the world that are not for our own interests, though.
Yeah, definitely. It's not, to kind of get tunnel vision and say that, the U.S. policy is directed by Saudi Arabia, because it's certainly not. But, Saudi Arabia buys a lot of weapons from the weapons makers, and they have a lot of interest and influence, and Saudi Arabia seems to have fallen in line somewhat with Israel's policy in the Middle East, and they have a lot of influence, and, there's just so many different types of business ties and oil ties that just keep this whole thing going. And it's not necessarily that, Mohammed bin Salman or the King of Saudi Arabia have all the power over U.S. policy, but it does result in the United States really putting Saudi Arabia first, rather than having a situation here where, the United States looks to uphold, the kind of the Enlightenment values and at least, condemning the murder, not necessarily that saying that we should be sanctioning a bunch of people or punishing Saudi Arabia by bombing them, but at the very least, kind of, pointing out that this was the wrong thing to do. And instead, we're just covering up for them. And so I think it probably, really hurts American influence around the world, because if anybody else reads, from any other country reads this statement, all they're going to hear is that the United States is trying to cover up the murder of Mohammed bin Salman.
Yeah, no doubt. And just something that I feel like I should point out too is, like, we were talking off air, like, we see critiques sometimes of the president that are kind of unfair, that, like, are trying too hard to find things that make him look stupid or something. But honestly, you and I were there was a moment when we were reading through the statement when we had to stop and actually look this up. Like, hold on, is this a parody version of this statement? Like, the number of exclamation points, like every other sentence, and the claim that Bashar al-Assad has killed millions of people. Like, it was not clear for a moment. I was actually, like, uncertain if this was even real. But it's real.
Right, and this isn't meant to be like, CNN running an article when, some 7th grade English teacher marked up one of Trump's statements. this was like really curious as to how the hell this like got published this way, especially with the Syria comment, with the fact that, this was obviously, even though it was titled a little bit differently, the official Trump statement on the Khashoggi murder, and that the first 4 paragraphs don't even mention the guy. And, when it does come down to it, all Trump is obviously trying to do is just create enough, I guess, deniability among his base that it wasn't Saudi Arabia, or it wasn't the king and the crown prince, when in reality, I think to everybody else that is pretty clear.
As much as like Trump's base is like, some of them might be sort of xenophobic or something about Arabs or Muslims, I don't know how many of them are actually like that, but like, I don't think this is going to hurt Trump, this like, that he's like given a sop to Saudi, given a sop to the actual world's greatest sponsor of terrorism. Somehow I don't think this is going to hurt him with his base.
All right, well, there's one more article I want to talk about in today's show with you, and this one's about John Bolton. But really, it highlights, I think, some key features of Trump's foreign policy. It's published in the Wall Street Journal. I'll link to it in the show notes page. But one of the things the article points out is that John Bolton actually doesn't control Trump's foreign policy when it comes to North Korea, and that's headed by Mike Pompeo. So, Will, I was just wondering what you thought about that. Is it good, bad?
But specifically North Korea?
Yeah, and the fact that Pompeo's the one that's kind of directing the U.S.
Yeah,
policy.
I mean, like, I'm no great fan of Pompeo, although I have sort of been, like, I don't know if I want to say impressed, but sort of not totally disappointed with his performance there. He seems to sort of be, like if it were John Bolton, John Bolton's MO is to always just, like, make maximum demands to, to try to, like, scuttle any kind of amity or peace or arms control agreements. And so it doesn't seem that Pompeo, there've been little moments with him, I think, but no, I think, that's definitely an improvement over Bolton. If, I'd rather Pompeo be in there in North Korea. But, Bolton sort of like, he seems to exercise a lot of the president's will in a lot of other areas though. So maybe we get into that.
Right. Yeah. I just wanted to highlight this because, as CIA director, I remember Mike Pompeo actually published a report that said that Kim Jong-un was like a rational actor. And so that seems to be a good thing. Pompeo has, met with Kim Jong-un on several occasions. And so I guess, the two of them are probably, hopefully at least a little friendly now. And, John Bolton's track record is, pushing the United States out of deals like he did with the agreed framework when he was in the Bush administration. And so I think it's great that John Bolton is involved here. A couple weeks before he became National Security Advisor, he was running articles saying the United States shouldn't make agreements with North Korea, and was actually saying the president had the power to carry out a first strike against North Korea. And so it's obvious that Bolton doesn't agree with Trump's policy on North Korea, so I think it's great that he's not involved. The next place I want to go is with Russia, where it does seem that John Bolton's heading up Trump's policy. I know a while back he actually traveled to Russia to set up a talk with Vladimir Putin. I think this was after the Helsinki summit, or this actually may have been the setup for the Helsinki summit. But since talks with the United States and Russia haven't gone particularly well, and now we're talking about withdrawing from the INF treaty. So, Will, I guess, what do you think of Bolton's policy on Russia? How does it line up with the Trump policy?
Yeah, this is an unfortunate one because, the candidate Trump, one of the only promising things about him was that perhaps he would be a little less hawkish on Russia. In fact, even might pursue some kind of détente actively. And so it seems that Bolton has definitely helped to scuttle that. As happy as I am that he's not ruining things with North Korea, he has been allowed to sort of screw things up with Russia. And it would not be the first time, With North Korea, there was the agreed framework, where he helped to ruin an arms deal. And then the ABM treaty, Bolton also helped to scuttle with Russia. And so this guy just has like a crazy track record of trying to destroy agreements. And yeah, it's no different here with Russia and Trump.
Right. And I guess the next agreement we're going to talk about that John Bolton didn't like is actually more in line with Trump, and that's the Iran nuclear deal. Again, this is a place where I think Bolton has some more influence and has actually, is in line with Trump's policy here. So, Will, what do you think about Bolton's Iran policy?
Yeah, definitely. This is the one that, Trump ran on this. He's been saying this blatantly, in all of his rhetoric. He's very hostile and hawkish toward Iran. And so here, I don't know if Bolton is making all the difference. In the Russia case, I think Bolton might be making some of the difference and pushing tipping the scales away from the, more détente policy. Whereas with Iran, I sort of get the idea that Trump would have done this anyway. But I'm still not happy that Bolton's in charge because he's really good at ruining these kind of agreements and, helping to get out of these types of things.
Yeah, I can't disagree. It's not a good thing to have Bolton involved, especially when it comes to Iran, where I don't understand the hatred necessarily. It makes a little bit more sense when it comes from like some of the military guys, I guess, because they, see Iran as their military enemy. But John Bolton has a long history of hating Iran. It's a vicious hatred. And, he was obviously on board with the Trump policy there. And I'm sure that he's not going to be upset about some Iranian kids starving to death. And will certainly blame the Iranian regime for it. The part of the article that I thought was the most interesting and really the most scary is there's this idea that John Bolton runs Trump's foreign policy for the most part and has even kind of been called in the White House President Bolton. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, sort of the theme of this article is like the headline is John Bolton energizes Trump's agenda and his own. And sort of the idea is that Bolton's just like catapulting all of his own pet projects through his position as NSA. But that's not quite true, as we sort of showed that, he's being scuttled sort of on the North Korea thing. So he's not fully getting his way on every last thing. And I think on the Iran thing, Trump would have probably done that anyway. So I don't think Bolton is just like taking the wheel there. But I'm sure Bolton has is sort of influential. I think he's sort of seen as like a graybeard, as someone with a lot of like expertise and knowledge and stuff. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to have that. But yeah, so that's sort of the impression I get.
Well, certainly a gray mustache.
Yes.
One of the things they point out, I guess, is John Bolton has been very good at filling it with his staff, and that the National Security Council is really now made up of his people. One of the few people to actually be taken down did not come because of a foreign policy move, but the First Lady took a very bold stance. And John Bolton's, I guess, number 2 here, Mira Ricardel, ends up getting fired. In this story, I'll go ahead and tell it. I guess, Miss Ricardel was talking bad about the First Lady behind her back, and she found out and issued a statement saying that, this woman should resign. It was quite incredible to see, a First Lady take that stance. And I guess Trump stood by his woman, and, she ends up resigning.
Yeah, that was kind of a surprising thing that, like, I didn't really expect that to, Melania to suddenly come out and just, like, demand the ousting of this official. But I guess I'm not too unhappy about it, though. If she was one of Bolton's people, then good riddance.
Yeah, and they described her as being, like, very fierce. She sounds like Bolton's attack dog.
All right, well, then good. Good on you, Melania.
All right, well, so I guess, maybe to wrap up here, do you want to give like 1 or 2 highlights of the reason why President Bolton should be about the most terrifying idea ever?
Yeah, I mean, it's like where to start, man. He's virtually supported every single war in America's recent history, and probably in all of American history. He's probably accepted every last war. His instincts on that are outrageous. He does not weigh facts at all. He's completely driven by like an ideological like hatred for other countries, it seems like. I hate to just like call it explain it by way of bigotry or something, but it's pretty clear that he's got some vitriol, like based on the way he talks and by the frequency with which he advocates violence and armed conflict and stuff. It's just really dangerous. I'm not sure if I can give you, like, I guess we could talk about like the scuttling of arms control agreements. He's very much in favor of like unilateral American action in the world. And so that would be a terrifying, we already have like an imperialistic executive. And so with Bolton at the head of that, it would be outrageous. Bolton is well known. I guess this is maybe my second one. I'm kind of rambling on. There's many things to choose from. But the second reason why Bolton is so terrifying to be in power is that he's well known for like not working with people at all. He's entirely just like his agenda. And if you don't like it, then get out of here. Get out of my face. And so like he would likely not be mitigated by other forces around him if he had that kind of power.
Right. And how I should have asked the question, Will, was actually this is, the article actually opens with the story of John Bolton taking office and hiring and hanging a gold-framed portrait of George Bush, H.W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and his vice president and secretary of state planning the first Iraq war. And so I think there we see like kind of Bolton's idea that, the United States could go in, kill a bunch of bad people and make the world a better place. And, he I guess, believes this and seems pretty dedicated.
Yeah, that's
to
pretty
it.
symbolic. The idea that he just sits there like in reverence of this photograph of like these officials and stuff planning to, kill people.
Yeah, it's almost cartoonish. It's almost unbelievably cartoonish. But, this is the world we live in, Will Porter. Thank you so much for coming on, talking on today's show. We talked about two themes here that really are just insane. Trump's statement there, it's in a lot of ways, like I said, we thought it was satire, almost unbelievable, not only with all the exclamation points, but the fact that, he attacks Iran in the beginning. And, the whole time this Khashoggi thing has been going on, I make crats about, I can't believe they haven't blamed Iran yet. And here, that's kind of finally what happens. And without ever actually blaming Iran for doing anything with Khashoggi, Iran ends up taking center stage in the hatred for Iran. And then, of course, we see the increasing influence of John Bolton, and we know that he hates Iran. And so it's just a very scary kind of thing to see the events that we're seeing now. And it's great to have you on the show to come on, talk about them and break them down and, help it all make sense with me. So, Will, tell people where they can find your work and more specifically where they can
sure. And I appreciate you having me on. I always like coming on talking about these subjects. If you guys want to read my writing, you can find me at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com in the viewpoint section. I have a large author archive at a site called the Daily Sheeple, and I've written a few pieces, some of which are with Kyle at Consortium News. If you want to help me out, if you want to support my work, you can find me at patreon.com/WKPjournalist. And, Twitter, if you want to find me on Twitter, at WKPANCAP, ANCAP. And, I haven't been as productive as I'd like to be lately, but we've got some stuff in the works that hopefully is going to be pretty exciting here. So, see what happens.
All right. Yeah. Announcements to come. Will Porter, leave them on cliffhanger there. Share the show at Libertarian Institute and donate to the show, patreon.com/foreign policy focus. Thanks, everybody. Yeah.